They didn't just flip a switch, they signed their own blackout. The alarm didn't scream, it stuttered. A broken rhythm. Beep, pause, beep, longer pause. Then silence stretched too far. I was already moving before I fully understood why. Boots hitting hardwood. The faint smell of heated plastic creeping into the air, like something invisible burning just out of sight. The ICU monitor beside my father's bed flickered once, twice, then went dark. Not a power surge. Not a storm. This was clean. Intentional. The backup inverter kicked in late. Too late for comfort. Its low hum grinding to life like an engine that didn't want to start. My hand was already on the control panel. Fingers moving from muscle memory, checking load, checking flow, forcing the system to stabilize. The air felt tight, like the whole house was holding its breath with him. 3 seconds. That's how long the line stayed flat before the system caught. 3 seconds that stretched into something I could feel in my chest. Then the machine blinked back. Weak, but alive. I exhaled slow, controlled, like I was back on a job site balancing a live line with no margin for error. And then I smelled it again. Burnt insulation, faint but unmistakable. Not inside. Outside. I turned toward the front window. Streetlights still on. Neighbors' porch lights glowing steady. My house, the only one that dipped. That wasn't failure. That was targeting. I stepped outside. The night air cool but carrying that same electrical tang, like ozone after a short circuit. Gravel crunched under my boots as I followed the line toward the side panel. The lock was hanging loose. Not broken, opened. That's when I saw them. Across the street, under the soft glow of a perfectly functioning street lamp, 3 silhouettes standing too still to be coincidence. Linda Carver in the center, posture straight, hands folded like she was attending a board meeting instead of standing outside my house at nearly midnight. 2 other HOA board members flanking her, clipboards in hand like they needed documentation for what they'd just done. She tilted her head slightly, that practiced smile already in place. "Mr. Blake," she called out, voice smooth. Controlled. We had to address an unauthorized power installation. It was a compliance issue. Compliance. The word hung in the air heavier than the silence that came before the backup system kicked in. I could still hear the inverter behind me, working harder than it should, carrying a load it was never meant to handle alone. Inside that house, my father was breathing because I forced the system to catch what they had deliberately cut. I didn't answer her right away, didn't raise my voice, didn't step closer. I just looked past her, down the line of houses, every porch light steady, every window glowing warm, untouched. Then I looked back at her. "You shut off my power," I said, voice level, almost quiet. She smiled wider, like I'd just confirmed something for her. "We corrected a violation," she replied. "You'll receive formal notice in the morning." Formal notice. While she stood there, under working lights powered by a grid she didn't understand. My jaw tightened, not from anger, but from recognition. Not of what they did, but of what they didn't know. Because as I stood there, listening to that inverter strain behind me, feeling the weight of 3 seconds that almost turned into something permanent, one thought settled in, cold and precise. They thought they took control tonight. They thought they decided who gets power on this street. What they didn't know was that I built the system they just tried to cut. I did not sleep that night, not really. The inverter kept humming like a stubborn engine that refused to stall, and every few minutes I would glance at the monitor to make sure the rhythm stayed steady. Beep, steady now. Consistent, but weaker than it should be. The system was holding, but it was not built to carry the full load alone for long. The air inside the room felt warmer than usual, thick with the faint metallic scent that lingers when circuits are pushed too hard. I sat there in the dark, one hand resting on the edge of the control panel, listening to every sound like it mattered, because it did. Around 3 in the morning, I grabbed my laptop from the kitchen counter. The screen lit up my hands, still faintly smudged with dust from the panel. Outside, I pulled up the original schematics, files I had not opened in years. Willow Creek Estates Infrastructure Grid, Revision 3. My name sat at the bottom of the design authorization like a quiet signature nobody ever thought to question. 8 years ago, this neighborhood was nothing but survey stakes and empty lots. I remember standing out here in steel-toe boots, measuring load distribution, mapping out redundancy paths, making sure no single failure could take down an entire block. Back then, the city wanted cost efficiency. The developers wanted speed. I gave them something smarter. A secondary distribution loop, buried just beneath the primary line, designed for emergency rerouting. It was not supposed to be touched unless things went very wrong, or unless someone knew exactly how to use it. I zoomed in on the section feeding my house. The isolation was clean, almost surgical. They did not cut the whole line. They isolated my node from the main grid, forcing everything onto my private backup. That meant one thing. They did not understand the system. They thought they were removing a violation. They had no idea they had just activated a failsafe path that still answered to me. I leaned back in the chair, the soft glow of the monitor reflecting off the walls, and for the first time since the alarm stuttered, I felt something shift. Not panic, not anger, clarity. By sunrise, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always did. Lawns trimmed, sprinklers ticking in perfect arcs, coffee brewing behind identical kitchen windows. You would never know what happened overnight unless you knew where to look. I stepped outside with a mug in my hand, the bitter smell of black coffee cutting through the lingering trace of burnt insulation. The panel was still open. I left it that way on purpose. Across the street, Linda was already out there, walking her usual path like nothing had happened, clipboard tucked under her arm. She glanced over, just once, that same composed expression locked in place. Control. That is what she thought she had. That is what they all thought they had. I took a slow sip and let the silence stretch between us. No arguments. No threats. Just a quiet understanding settling into place. They made their move in the dark, thinking nobody would push back. They expected complaints, maybe a lawyer, maybe a delay. What they did not expect was someone who understood every inch of the system they were standing on. I set the mug down on the railing and looked back at the panel, then down the street, following the invisible lines running beneath every house, every light, every perfectly controlled piece of their little world. And that was when the plan stopped being an idea and started becoming something real. I was not going to fight them with paperwork. I was not going to argue compliance. I was going to use the one thing they never bothered to understand. The system itself. The second cup of coffee tasted colder, sharper, like it had been sitting longer than it should, even though I had just poured it. The morning sun hit the street at that perfect angle, lighting up every identical driveway, every polished SUV, every mailbox lined up like soldiers following rules they never questioned. I stood there on my porch, watching the system from the outside now, not as a homeowner, but as the guy who built the invisible layer holding all of it together. Inside, the inverter was still running. I could hear it faintly through the wall, a low steady hum that reminded me of a generator on a job site running past its comfortable limit. It would hold, but not forever. That was the reality. And reality is where systems either fail or reveal what they are really made of. I stepped back inside and closed the door gently, the soft click echoing louder than it should in a house that had not fully recovered from last night. My father was still resting, the monitor steady now, numbers moving in a rhythm that felt fragile but controlled. I checked the load again, adjusted a minor imbalance, and let my fingers linger on the panel for a second longer than necessary. This was not just engineering anymore. This was personal. I moved back to the laptop, pulled up the deeper layers of the grid architecture, the parts nobody outside a small circle had ever needed to understand. The secondary loop was not just a backup. It was designed with priority routing, a feature the city never fully utilized because it required someone who actually understood distribution logic instead of just reading reports. I had built it for emergencies, for moments when the system needed to decide what mattered most. Hospitals, emergency services, critical infrastructure, and technically, a residential ICU setup tied into a certified medical circuit qualified under that same priority classification. I traced the lines across the map, each house connected like a quiet dependency chain. They all pulled from the same backbone, even if they thought they were independent. That was the illusion of modern infrastructure. Everything looks separate until it is not. Around noon, a white envelope appeared on my front step. I saw it before I even opened the door, placed perfectly in the center like it belonged there. Official HOA letterhead, bold print, the kind designed to look authoritative without actually being authority. I picked it up, felt the weight of a few sheets inside, and for a second I just held it there, letting the paper sit between my fingers. Then I opened it. Violation notice. Unauthorized electrical installation. Immediate compliance required. Additional penalties pending. The language was clean, almost polite, like last night had not happened at all. Like they had not stood across the street while my system struggled to keep a human being stable. I let out a slow breath, folded the paper once, then set it down on the kitchen counter next to the laptop. No anger, no reaction, just confirmation. They were following their script. That meant I could follow mine. I turned back to the screen, pulled up the control interface tied to the secondary loop, a layer that had not been touched in years but still responded like it had been waiting. The cursor blinked, steady and patient. Access was not the issue. It never was. Understanding was. And that was where the difference lived. I rested my hand on the trackpad, feeling that same calm settle in again, the kind that only shows up when everything becomes clear at once. They thought they isolated one house. They thought they solved a problem. What they actually did was shift the entire system into a state they did not even know existed. And now, for the first time since they decided to act, the control was not sitting in a meeting room with clipboards and rules. It was sitting right here, in front of me, waiting for a decision. By mid-afternoon, the neighborhood settled into its usual rhythm, the kind that looks peaceful if you do not know where to look. Lawnmowers in the distance, sprinklers ticking in perfect arcs, the faint hum of air conditioning units cycling on and off like clockwork. Everything appeared stable on the surface, but I could see the imbalance underneath. The inverter inside my house had shifted tone slightly, a deeper hum now, like it was carrying more weight than it should for this long. I checked the panel again, fingers moving across switches and readouts, making small adjustments to keep the load balanced. It was holding, but it was not sustainable. Not like this. That was the reality they created when they decided to isolate my line. I moved back to the laptop, the screen still open to the grid interface, and began tracing the load distribution across the secondary loop. Every house on this street pulled from the same backbone, but now the system was compensating in ways it was never meant to operate under normal conditions. Small fluctuations, minor inefficiencies, nothing anyone else would notice. But I did. I always did. Around 3 in the afternoon, I heard tires roll slowly over gravel. Not hurried, not uncertain, deliberate. I looked up through the front window and saw Linda again, this time pulling up closer, her car stopping just short of my driveway like there was an invisible line she did not want to cross. She stepped out with that same controlled posture, clipboard in hand, sunglasses catching the sunlight like a shield. She walked up to the edge of the walkway but did not step onto it. Not yet. "Mr. Blake," she called out, her voice carrying just enough to sound official without raising it. "I trust you received our notice." I stepped outside, closing the door behind me, the soft click echoing again in that same quiet way. The air felt warmer now, heavier, like the day itself was pressing down on everything a little harder. I nodded once. "I did," she smiled, the kind that suggests resolution without offering it. "Then you understand the next step. If the violation is not corrected by end of day, we will proceed with further action. Fines. Potential service interruption. Service interruption." The phrase almost made me laugh, but I kept my face still. They had no idea what that actually meant in a system like this. I took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch just enough to make her shift her weight slightly. "You already interrupted service," I said, voice calm, even. Her expression did not change, but I saw it in her eyes. A flicker, not doubt, just calculation. "We addressed an unauthorized modification," she replied. "The community standards apply to everyone." Community standards. I glanced past her again, down the street, at the houses running perfectly on power they did not even think about. Then I looked back at her. "You might want to review how that system actually works," I said quietly. She tilted her head, just a fraction. "We have consulted with professionals," she answered. Of course they had. People who read summaries, not systems. People who saw lines on paper, not the way those lines behaved under pressure. I nodded once more, like I accepted that answer, even though I knew exactly how incomplete it was. "Good," I said. "Then this should be straightforward." I turned back toward the door, not waiting for her response, not giving her the argument she expected. Behind me, I could feel her watching, trying to decide if she had control of the situation or if something had shifted without her noticing. Inside, the hum of the inverter greeted me again, steady but strained. I walked straight to the laptop, sat down, and placed my hand on the trackpad. The interface blinked back, ready. The system was already compensating for what they had done. All it needed now was direction. And for the first time since this started, I was ready to give it one. I did not move right away. My hand stayed on the trackpad, fingers resting just enough to feel the slight warmth from the machine, like it was alive in its own quiet way. Outside, the neighborhood carried on like nothing had shifted, but I could hear it now beneath everything else. The system, a faint, layered hum running through walls, through lines, through everything they depended on without ever thinking about it. I opened the control panel fully, unlocking the deeper layer most people never even knew existed. The interface was simple on the surface, clean lines, clear labels, designed for engineers who did not need decoration to understand complexity. But underneath that simplicity was control. Real control. I navigated to the secondary loop diagnostics and watched the data populate across the screen. Load distribution, voltage variance, micro fluctuations that looked insignificant unless you knew how to read them. And I did. The imbalance had spread further down the line than I expected. When they isolated my house, the system compensated by redistributing load across adjacent nodes. It worked, but it was inefficient, like forcing a detour through streets that were never meant to handle traffic that heavy. I leaned back slightly, eyes moving from one section of the grid to another, mapping it out in my head the way I used to on job sites, standing in dirt lots with nothing but blueprints and intuition. They had not just created a problem for me. They had introduced instability into their own system. The kind that does not show up right away, but builds quietly until something gives. And right now, I was the only one who could see it clearly. The inverter inside the house shifted tone again, just a fraction deeper, a reminder that time was not on anyone's side here. I glanced toward the hallway, toward the steady rhythm of the monitor, then back to the screen. This was not about reacting anymore. This was about deciding. I moved the cursor to the control section tied to priority routing, a feature buried deep enough that most contractors never even accessed it. It required authorization, not just technical, but structural. The kind tied to original system design. My name was still there. It had never been removed. I hovered over the override option for a moment, not hesitating, just measuring. Once activated, the system would stop treating every node equally. It would prioritize based on classification, just like it was designed to do in an emergency. Essential loads first. Everything else adjusted around that. I let out a slow breath, feeling that same calm settle in again, the kind that comes when a problem stops being chaos and starts becoming structure. Outside, a car door slammed somewhere down the street, followed by distant voices, normal life continuing on top of a system they had already pushed out of balance. They still thought they were in control. They still believed this was a compliance issue, something they could manage with notices and deadlines. I looked at the grid again, every house connected, every line feeding into the same backbone, every decision now waiting on a single input. Mine. My fingers moved, not fast, not dramatic, just precise. I adjusted a few parameters first, small changes that redirected minor loads, testing the response, watching how the system reacted. It responded exactly the way I expected. Predictable, logical, ready. That was all I needed. I rested my hand for a second, then moved the cursor back to the override control. No anger, no hesitation, just clarity. They had already flipped their switch. Now it was my turn to show them what that actually meant. The cursor blinked once, steady and patient, like it had all the time in the world. I did not. I pressed the override. There was no dramatic sound, no sudden blackout, no visible shift through the window. Just a quiet confirmation line appearing on the screen, a single change in system status that most people would not even recognize. Priority routing active. For a second, nothing else happened. Then the data began to move. Numbers adjusted, loads recalculated, distribution paths rerouted beneath the surface, like traffic quietly changing direction without anyone noticing. I leaned forward slightly, watching the system respond exactly the way it was designed to under controlled authority. Essential circuits stabilized first. My house. The ICU line. The inverter's hum softened almost immediately, the strain easing as the system fed its support from the secondary loop. The air in the room shifted, not physically, but in a way you feel when something stops being on the edge of failure. I exhaled slowly, eyes still locked on the screen. Then the rest of the grid began to react. Not a shutdown, not a failure, a redistribution. Non-essential loads were deprioritized, scaled back just enough to balance the system without triggering alarms. Air conditioning units cycled less frequently. Exterior lighting dimmed by a fraction. Pool pumps delayed their schedules. Small things. Subtle things. But across an entire street, those small adjustments added up. I stood up and walked back outside. The late afternoon sun now lower, casting longer shadows across the pavement. At first glance, everything looked the same. It always does. But then I saw it. The flicker of a porch light that took half a second longer to stabilize. The soft hum of an air conditioner cutting off sooner than expected. A neighbor stepping outside, glancing up at a light fixture like they could not quite place what felt different. Confusion, not panic. That was the key. Down the street, a garage door stopped halfway for a second before continuing, the motor adjusting to the slight voltage shift. Nobody was losing power, but nobody had full control either. And that was the difference. My phone buzzed in my hand, the vibration sharp against my palm. Unknown number. I already knew who it was before I answered. Mr. Blake. Linda's voice came through, tighter than before, the smooth edge of control just beginning to thin. We are experiencing some irregularities in the neighborhood power distribution. Are you aware of any issues on your end? I looked down the street again, watching as another light flickered faintly before settling. No issues here, I said calmly. Everything is stable. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to register that she was recalculating. We have consulted with the utility provider, she continued, her tone carefully measured. They indicated there may be an internal distribution complication. Internal? I almost smiled. That sounds like something you should take seriously, I replied. Silence again. Not long. Just enough. We expect full cooperation from all residents during this process, she added, the word cooperation carrying more weight now than it did this morning. I ended the call without responding, slipping the phone back into my pocket. Across the street, Linda stepped out of her house again, this time without the clipboard, her gaze moving along the line of homes like she was trying to see something that had always been there, but never mattered before. I stayed where I was, hands relaxed at my sides, watching the system do exactly what it was designed to do. Balance itself. Prioritize what mattered. Adjust everything else. They thought control meant flipping a switch. They thought authority came from a notice on a piece of paper. But real control does not announce itself. It does not argue. It just works. And now, for the first time since this started, they were the ones reacting to a system they did not understand. By early evening, the street no longer felt the same, even if it looked identical to anyone passing through. The changes were subtle, but they had settled into a pattern now. A rhythm that did not quite match what people were used to. Lights hesitated before reaching full brightness. Air conditioning units cycled unevenly, some homes cooler than others, some systems working harder than they should. Nothing was broken, but nothing was perfect either. And perfection was the standard this neighborhood built itself on. I stood by the window, watching the reactions unfold in real time. A man 2 houses down stepped outside, phone pressed to his ear, pacing slowly as he looked up at his porch light like it had personally offended him. Across the street, Linda moved from driveway to driveway, speaking in controlled tones, her posture still composed, but her movements sharper now, more frequent. She was no longer managing. She was responding. Inside, the system continued to hum, balanced but deliberate. My house was stable, fully supported now, the ICU line steady and protected under priority routing. I checked the monitor again, watching the consistent rhythm, then returned to the laptop. The grid display had changed slightly, reflecting the new hierarchy I had activated. Essential loads held firm. Everything else adjusted around them, constantly recalculating, constantly redistributing. It was not chaos. It was order, just not the kind they were used to controlling. My phone buzzed again, this time with multiple notifications stacking up in quick succession. HOA group alerts. Resident complaints. Requests for updates. I did not open them right away. I already knew what they would say. Instead, I watched the system a little longer, studying how it behaved under sustained priority conditions. It was efficient, but it was also sending a message. A quiet one. Around 7 o'clock, headlights swept across the front of my house, followed by the slow roll of a utility truck stopping near the curb. 2 men stepped out, reflective vests catching the fading light, toolkits in hand. They walked straight to the main access panel down the street, opening it with the kind of confidence that comes from thinking the problem is simple. I watched them work for a moment, checking connections, running diagnostics, tapping screens, expecting to find a fault they could isolate and fix. But there was no fault. Just a system operating exactly as designed under a condition they did not initiate and did not control. One of them stepped back, shaking his head slightly, pulling out a phone. A few minutes later, Linda approached them, her steps quicker now, her voice lower, more urgent. I could not hear the words, but I could read the shift. Explanation turning into confusion. Authority meeting a limit it could not push through. I stepped outside again, the evening air cooler now, carrying the faint layered hum of a neighborhood adjusting to something it did not understand. The utility workers glanced up briefly as I approached, their expressions neutral but questioning. Linda turned toward me, and for the first time since this started, her composure cracked just enough to show something underneath. Not fear. Not yet. But uncertainty. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice tighter, less controlled than before. "The utility company is unable to identify the source of this distribution issue." I nodded once, hands relaxed at my sides. "That makes sense," I replied calmly. She held my gaze for a second longer than she wanted to, searching for something she could still use to regain control. "If you have any information that could assist in resolving this situation," she continued, choosing her words carefully now, "we expect you to provide it." Expect. The word landed differently this time. I glanced past her at the open panel, at the workers still scanning a system that was not broken, just redirected. Then I looked back at her. "This is not a malfunction," I said quietly. "It is a configuration." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that came before. Because for the first time, she understood that this was not something she could fix with a call or a notice. This was something she had triggered without understanding the consequences. And now, the control she thought she had was sitting somewhere she could not reach. The street grew quieter as the sun dropped below the rooftops, but it was not the kind of quiet people relax into. It was the kind that makes you listen. Every house was still running, still lit, still functioning, but now every small inconsistency felt amplified. A light that dimmed a fraction too long. A thermostat that did not quite hit the number it was set to. A garage door that hesitated before closing. Tiny delays stacking into something nobody could ignore anymore. I stood near the edge of my driveway, watching it all settle into place like a system finding its new equilibrium. Behind me, the steady rhythm of the ICU monitor carried through the open window, stronger now, supported, stable. That was the only signal that mattered. Everything else was just noise. The utility workers were still at the panel, but their movements had slowed. One of them closed the access door halfway, then opened it again, like repeating the action might reveal something new. It did not. There was nothing broken to fix. Linda stood a few feet away from them, arms crossed now, her posture no longer neutral but guarded. Her eyes moved from the panel to me, then back again, as if she was trying to connect 2 points she had not considered before. I could see it forming, not understanding, just the awareness that she was no longer ahead of the situation. My phone buzzed again, louder this time in the stillness. A direct call. I answered without looking at the screen. "Mr. Blake." Her voice came through immediately, closer now, sharper, no longer carrying that polished layer from earlier. "This needs to be resolved tonight." I looked straight at her across the street while she spoke, watching the words leave her mouth a fraction of a second after I heard them through the phone. "It is resolved," I said calmly. She stopped pacing. "Just for a second." "No," she replied. The word clipped, controlled but tight. "The entire street is experiencing disruption. This is unacceptable." I let the silence stretch just long enough to make her feel it. "If this is connected to your system," she continued, choosing the word carefully, "then you need to restore normal operation immediately." Restore. Like she thought this was something I had broken. I glanced down the street again, at the homes adjusting to a reality they had never needed to think about before. Then I looked back at her. "Normal operation," I repeated quietly. "You mean the version where you control access?" She did not answer right away. The utility workers both looked up now, their attention shifting between us, sensing that the problem was not in the panel they were inspecting. "You are part of this community," she said finally, her tone shifting again, trying to reframe control as obligation. You are subject to the same standards as everyone else. I almost smiled, but did not. That is where you are wrong, I said, voice even, steady. I am subject to the system, not the way you interpret it. Across the street, one of the porch lights flickered again, just a fraction longer this time before stabilizing. Another house followed, then another, like a quiet ripple moving through the line. Not failure. Adjustment. The system was tightening its distribution, refining its balance under the override I had set. Linda lowered the phone slightly, her eyes locked on mine now, no longer pretending this was just a routine enforcement issue. What do you want? She asked, and this time there was no softness left in the question. Just direct, controlled urgency. I let the moment sit there, the hum of the neighborhood filling the space between us, every house now subtly dependent on a configuration they could not influence. I want the system to operate the way it was designed, I said finally. Her expression shifted, just slightly. Not agreement. Not yet. But recognition. Because for the first time since this started, she was not speaking from authority. She was asking for access to something she no longer controlled. The air felt different now, like the entire street was holding itself together on something invisible, something nobody could name, but everyone could feel. I stood there for a moment longer, watching Linda across the street, watching the way her shoulders had shifted, just slightly, from command to calculation. The hum of the neighborhood wrapped around everything, steady but no longer effortless. Inside my house, the ICU monitor held its rhythm, clean and consistent, the only signal that truly mattered in all of this. I turned without another word and walked back inside, closing the door behind me with that same quiet click that had marked every turning point since this started. The laptop was still open, the system still active, the override still in place. Lines of data moved across the screen, stable, controlled, responsive. I sat down slowly, not rushed, not pressured, just present. The system was waiting, not for permission, but for direction. I adjusted one parameter first, then another, small corrections that refined the distribution without removing the pressure. The imbalance across the street tightened slightly, just enough to remind everyone that stability was not automatic anymore. My phone buzzed again almost immediately. This time I did not answer. I let it ring once, twice, then stop. A minute later, it buzzed again, followed by another notification. Then another. The pattern was clear. Urgency had replaced authority. I leaned back in the chair, letting the weight of the moment settle. Outside, I could hear a neighbor's voice, frustrated but controlled, talking about inconsistent cooling, about lights not behaving the way they should. Small inconveniences, but in a place. Built on control and predictability, those small things carried weight. They always do. I reached for the folder on the counter, the HOA notice still folded neatly inside. I opened it again, reading the language one more time. Compliance required. Immediate correction. Further action pending. I placed it beside the laptop, right next to the system interface, and for a second the contrast was almost perfect. Paper authority versus real control. I exhaled slowly, then moved the cursor back to the main control panel. This was the moment. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just precise. I adjusted the routing again, this time expanding the priority allocation across the entire street, stabilizing the distribution fully, restoring balance not as a reaction, but as a decision. The system responded instantly. The fluctuations disappeared. Lights across the neighborhood settled into steady brightness. Air conditioning units resumed normal cycles. Garage doors moved without hesitation. The quiet tension dissolved into something familiar again. Stability. But this time, it was not theirs. It was mine. My phone rang again, and this time I answered. There was no introduction on the other end. Just Linda's voice, quieter now, measured in a different way. The system has stabilized, she said. Not a question. A statement. I looked at the screen, at the clean distribution, at the structure holding everything together exactly as it was meant to. Yes, I replied. There was a pause, longer than before, the kind that carries more weight than words. We will be reviewing our previous actions, she said finally, each word chosen carefully now, stripped of the tone she had used before. And the notice? I asked, glancing at the paper beside me. Another pause, shorter this time. It will be withdrawn. I nodded once, even though she could not see it. Good, I said. Silence settled between us again, But it was not the same silence from before. This one was understood. I ended the call and closed the laptop. The soft